ASC Civil's pad management feature was specifically designed for use in mass grading tract-type subdivision lots. To define a pad, the user must provide a pre-drawn 2D lightweight polyline. The polyline may be on any layer and can exist at any elevation, but it must be closed. Since the driveway grades are calculated by measuring from the curb to the polyline, that distance should be taken into account when creating the polyline. The pad is defined by selecting the option from the ASC Civil menu. The user is first prompted to select the polyline to be used. ASC Civil's pad definitions are managed by referencing the design elevations at two user-selected curb reference locations. The stations are used to determine the design elevation at each curb reference, regardless of the offset. Successful selection of the polyline and the curb references result in the definition of an ASC Civil pad. The pad is labeled in 3D lines, called pad ties, project from the curve references to the closest vertices on the polyline. Since the pad has not yet been attached to an alignment, the label will reference curb elevations of 0. After setting the adjacent alignment current and using the ASC Civil menu option to attach the pad to the alignment, the label will be updated with the appropriate elevation. The label, polyline, and connecting pad tie vertices are also adjusted to the pad elevation. Now, let's look at the road design and the lot from a section view. The pad is defined using the 2D lightweight polyline object. Its elevation is always dependent on the finished floor elevation and thickness. The finished floor does not physically exist in the drawing, since it's not generally used for earthworks. Its value is calculated based on the curb reference elevations and the finished floor design parameters. The pad definition is connected to the curb reference by the pad ties. By default, the pad ties project from the curb elevation to the top of the pad. However, the vertex near the pad can be forced to a location below the pad elevation. Or the vertex near the curb can be forced to some location below the top of curb elevation. Or the entire pad tie may be forced to project flat from the curb reference to the pad. The horizontal proximity of each vertex in relation to the curb references and the pad may also be adjusted as needed. For this example, we'll assume the pad tie default values. Several values in the finished floor dialog refer to heights from curb references. These values are always measuring to the finished floor elevation. The pad elevation is never referenced in the design parameters. The design parameters dialog settings determine the size of the pad's design envelope. This imaginary vertical region represents the total range of elevations that each individual pad definition may be adjusted to. The minimum pad elevation, as shown in blue, is always determined by the height from either curb reference. The maximum elevation, shown in red, is determined by either the height from a curb reference or by the approximated driveway grade. The allowable range of adjustment is equivalent to the thickness of the design envelope and is controlled by values set in the design parameters dialog. When the pad elevation is adjusted by the user by specifying either a distance, floor elevation, pad elevation, or floor thickness, the pad definition will move down or up within the design envelope. Pads are color-coded. So long as a pad does not reach the limits of its design envelope, it maintains color number 7. If a pad is adjusted to an elevation that places the finished floor at or above the upper limit of the design envelope, the adjustment is constrained so that the floor is never higher than the ceiling of the design envelope. When this situation occurs, the pad is considered maximized, and the pad assumes color number 230 to graphically indicate its position in the design envelope. The opposite is true when the pad is adjusted downwards. However, in this case, the pad elevation will never be allowed to drop below the lower limit of the design envelope. In this condition, the pad assumes color number 150. ASC civil pad definitions can also be passively adjusted by changes to the vertical alignment of the road. If the road design moves up, the design envelope moves with it, since its position is determined by the elevations of the curb references. In this scenario, the pad definition is automatically pushed up so that the pad elevation is not lower than the minimum elevation of the design envelope. The pad color changes accordingly. The opposite is true for changes to the road design that lower the design envelope such that the floor elevation exceeds the new upper limit. The pad definition is lowered until the finished floor meets the maximum height above the curb reference or the maximum driveway grade. If the desired effect is to force the pads to stay at a specific position relative to the curb elevations, then the user must make adjustments to the design parameters through the dialog. The size of the design envelope may be reduced to some small value. It may be forced to a thickness of 0. Or it may be given a negative value, in which case the minimum height occurs above the maximum height. In cases where the design envelope thickness is less than or equal to the floor thickness, the pad definition will always be adjusted such that the finished floor elevation does not exceed the upper limit of the design envelope. And the pad polylines will always be displayed using color 230. In hillside developments, it's sometimes necessary to adjust the minimum heights in the design parameters dialog to some negative values. This allows placement of the finished floor below the higher curb references in extreme street grading conditions.